April 4th, 1945. The village of Merkers, Germany, in the Thuringia region, roughly 15 miles from the town of Gotha. The 3rd Battalion, 358th Infantry Regiment, part of the 90th Infantry Division under General George S. Patton's Third Army, took the village with little resistance, one more small German town falling as the American advance pushed deeper into a collapsing Reich. Patton's army had crossed the Rhine less than 2 weeks earlier and was now driving hard through central Germany, territory that would soon become part of the post-war Soviet occupation zone, racing against time before political boundaries redrew who controlled which stretch of the collapsing country. Nothing about Merkers seemed different from a dozen other towns the division had already passed through that spring. Nobody in the battalion had any idea they were standing almost directly above one of the largest concentrations of stolen wealth in modern history. 2 days later, on April 6th, military police attached to the 90th Infantry Division were on a routine foot patrol through the town when they spotted 2 women walking down the street who didn't quite fit the pattern of the local population. The MPs stopped to question them and learned the women were French displaced persons, civilians taken from their homes in France and transported to Germany as forced labor, part of the vast network of forced laborers the Reich had scattered across occupied and domestic territory to keep its war economy functioning as its own manpower ran short. In the course of the conversation, the women mentioned something that made the MPs stop taking notes casually and start taking them seriously: a salt mine on the edge of town and German trucks that had spent recent weeks hauling load after load of something valuable down into it. The MPs relayed what they'd heard up the chain of command. Within hours, the 90th Division's Counterintelligence Corps detachment had opened a formal investigation, working from the displaced person's account to identify the mine in question, the Kaiserroda salt mine, a sprawling underground complex with more than 35 miles of tunnels and a dozen separate entrances, most of them completely unremarkable from the surface, indistinguishable from any of the dozens of other industrial mine works scattered across the German countryside. What the investigation began turning up over the following days made clear the French women hadn't been exaggerating. This wasn't a small cache. German records and local testimony pointed towards something on a scale nobody in the 90th Division had encountered anywhere else in the war. The full picture came into focus once American engineers gained access to the mine's deeper chambers. Since mid-March, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east, German officials had been quietly evacuating the Reichsbank's gold reserves and a substantial portion of the nation's paper currency reserves out of the capital, moving them by rail and truck to the one place they judged safe from both Allied bombing and the advancing Red Army, the deep, stable salt caverns beneath Merkers. Alongside the bank's own wealth, German museum officials had been shipping crated artwork out of 14 major Berlin museums to the same location, evacuating irreplaceable paintings and sculptures out of a capital everyone in the German government now understood was doomed. And mixed in with both, without any attempt at separation or distinction, was a third category of material entirely, property confiscated by the SS from concentration camp victims across occupied Europe. If you want to hear the stories that show you exactly what American soldiers found waiting behind the front lines in the war's final weeks, subscribe. We find these accounts, we verify them, and we tell them exactly as they happened. On April 8th, with the scale of what lay underground becoming clearer by the hour, American engineers dynamited the mine entrance to gain full access, descending hundreds of feet below the surface through tunnels that stretched in every direction, following leads and partial records toward the chamber the investigation had identified as the most likely target. What they found deeper inside stopped even hardened combat veterans in their tracks. A vault chamber known simply as Room Number 8, a space roughly 75 feet by 150 feet, held row after knee-high row of burlap sacks, 7,000 of them, sealed, numbered, and stacked with the same methodical precision the Reichsbank applied to everything it handled. An entire nation's gold reserves reduced to inventory rows in a cavern that had never been intended to hold anything grander than mined salt. Inside those sacks, gold bars and gold coins, roughly 250 tons of it in total, alongside 8,000 additional gold bars stored separately, 55 boxes of gold bullion, and hundreds of bales of foreign currency confiscated or stockpiled from across occupied Europe. A physical accumulation of wealth on a scale most of the soldiers standing in that room had never imagined seeing in one place in their lives. The vault door to room 8 itself remained locked, its key nowhere to be found, and American engineers, wary that the Germans might have booby-trapped the entrance rather than simply lost the key, chose instead to blast a hole through the brick masonry beside the door to gain entry without risking a detonation that might have destroyed both the treasure and the men trying to reach it. The gold and currency alone would have made Merkers one of the most significant discoveries of the entire war. What made it something closer to unbearable was what soldiers found alongside it, stacked in the same chambers with no attempt at separation. Scattered among the crates of currency and stacked artwork were suitcases packed with personal items. Watches, cigarette cases, spoons, forks, vases, wedding rings, and gold dental work, some of it hammered flat to save storage space. All of it plainly the confiscated property of individual human beings rather than institutional wealth. There was no paperwork accompanying these particular items that pretended otherwise, no attempt by the SS to disguise what these objects actually were or where they had actually come from. Soldiers who had spent the war fighting an enemy army now found themselves standing in a room that made unmistakably clear exactly what that enemy had also been doing to unarmed civilians the entire time. The evidence sitting in the same vault as the nation's gold reserves, as though the distinction between stolen bank assets and stolen human belongings had simply never occurred to the men who packed it all away together. Word of the discovery moved up the chain of command within hours, reaching General Patton directly. Patton, already deep in one of the most demanding stretches of the entire European campaign, coordinating an army group racing across central Germany, while simultaneously beginning to process the atrocity reports arriving from camps discovered elsewhere in his sector, made the decision to bring both General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, and General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, to see the find in person rather than simply process it through routine reporting channels. Something about the scale of what his men had described convinced him this needed direct eyes on it at the highest level, not a summary passed along a chain of staff officers who would never fully grasp what the numbers actually represented until they stood in the room themselves. On April 12, 1945, all 3 men descended together into the Kaiserota mine, riding a mine elevator hundreds of feet below the surface to stand in room 8 among the gold and the looted personal effects. The elevator itself gave several of the accompanying officers a moment's pause. An ordinary mining cage, rated for miners and equipment, now carrying 3 of the most senior commanders in the entire American military hundreds of feet underground on a single cable, with no real way to verify the Germans hadn't sabotaged the mechanism before retreating. Patton reportedly joked about the risk to ease the tension as the cage descended, though nobody in the group fully relaxed until their boots hit solid ground again at the bottom of the shaft. Eisenhower later wrote in detail about what he'd seen in that chamber. The suitcases of gold and silver items hammered flat, plainly looted from private homes across occupied Europe, evidence of a system that had reached directly into ordinary households and stripped them of everything of value before most of their owners ever reached a concentration camp at all. He described the visual impact of it in stark terms, the physical scale of the wealth somehow making the underlying theft feel more real and more calculated than any written report could have conveyed on its own. Patton, in his own private writing, cataloged the same objects with the same disbelief: cigarette cases, wristwatch cases, spoons, forks, vases, gold dental work, acquired, in his own blunt phrasing, through nothing better than what he called bandit methods. The 2 men who had built reputations on toughness and composure under fire both found themselves standing in that vault, struggling to process an entirely different category of horror than the one they'd spent the war preparing for on the battlefield. Not the chaos and violence of combat, but the cold, patient, bureaucratic theft of an entire continent's wealth, and alongside it, thousands of individual human lives reduced to line items in the same inventory. The visit to Merkers that day came only hours after the same 3 generals had stood in the barracks of Ohrdruf, 60 miles away, absorbing the discovery of a concentration camp's worth of dead. The contrast could hardly have been sharper or more disorienting. A morning spent confronting the direct human cost of the system they were fighting, followed by an afternoon spent standing among the wealth that same system had extracted, sorted, and stored with the same bureaucratic precision it had applied to everything else. Evidence upon evidence that the machinery of theft and the machinery of murder had, in the end, been run by exactly the same institution using exactly the same methods. What followed was a recovery operation nearly as staggering in its logistics as the discovery itself had been in its scale. Over the following weeks, more than 11,000 individual containers of gold, currency, and looted valuables were carefully inventoried, photographed, and sealed before being loaded onto a convoy of 10-ton trucks bound for a secure vault in Frankfurt. Each container documented in enough detail to survive whatever legal and diplomatic questions would inevitably follow once the war ended and nations began the long process of sorting out what had been stolen from whom. Army engineers strung floodlights through the mine's tunnels to keep the operation running around the clock, soldiers working in shifts through a space that had, only days earlier, been a closely guarded secret known to almost no one outside the Reichsbank's own inner circle. Fighter aircraft were dispatched to circle overhead during the transport itself, a precaution against the remote but real possibility that what remained of the Luftwaffe might attempt one final, desperate raid to reclaim what the Reich had lost, even as the broader German war effort collapsed on every front simultaneously. The total 1945 valuation of everything recovered came to roughly $520 million, a figure worth close to $8 billion in modern terms, though the men who cataloged the personal items taken from camp victims understood well enough that no dollar figure could capture what that particular portion of the find actually represented. The artwork recovered from Merkers received its own careful accounting in the weeks that followed, overseen in part by the Army's Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, the unit that would later become popularly known as the Monuments Men, tasked across the entire European theater with locating, protecting, and eventually returning cultural treasures displaced by 6 years of war and systematic Nazi looting. Alongside carefully crated masterworks were roughly 400 paintings found simply lying loose in the mine's chambers, unprotected by any crate or padding, including Edouard Manet's In the Winter Garden and a collection of engravings by Albrecht Dürer. Artwork evacuated from 14 major Berlin museums in the war's final desperate weeks between March 20th and March 31st and left, ultimately, in exactly the kind of underground vault that had also become the resting place for the Reichs. Stolen gold and its victims' confiscated belongings, untangling which pieces belonged to German state collections, which had been looted from museums in occupied countries, and which had been stripped from private Jewish collections before their owners were deported would take Monuments Men investigators years of painstaking work well beyond the war's actual end. The Kaiserroda salt mine at Merkers still exists today, no longer a working potash mine, but a tourist destination that draws tens of thousands of visitors a year to descend into the same chambers where American soldiers once stood among 7,000 sacks of gold and the scattered, hammered flat remnants of stolen lives. Visitors can walk through Room 8 itself, see reconstructed displays of the burlap Reichsbank sacks and mocked-up gold bars, examine period photographs of the mine carts once used to haul the treasure through the tunnels, and stand in the exact space where 3 of the most experienced military commanders in the American Army found themselves for a few disorienting hours in April of 1945, confronting a different kind of evidence than the kind they'd spent years learning to process on the battlefield. The gold and currency recovered from Merkers eventually became part of a decades-long international effort to identify rightful owners and return looted assets, a process complicated by the sheer scale of the theft, the destruction of records during the war's final chaos, and the deaths of so many of the original owners whose gold, currency, and personal belongings had ended up sealed in burlap sacks half a kilometer beneath a small Thuringian town. Some of the artwork found loose in the mine's chambers took decades to fully trace back to its rightful owners or their heirs, a process that in certain cases continued well into the 21st century, long after every general who descended into that mine elevator on April 12, 1945, had passed away. What remained most vivid in the accounts left behind by the men who saw it firsthand wasn't the gold itself, staggering as the sheer quantity of it was, but the smaller, quieter horror sitting beside it, proof, stacked in neat rows half a kilometer underground, of exactly how far a system built on theft and murder had been willing to go, and how meticulously it had kept its own books while doing it, treating a nation's gold reserves and its victims' wedding rings as though they belonged in the very same ledger. If stories like this one matter to you, the ones that show what was actually waiting behind the front lines in the war's final weeks, subscribe and stay with us. We'll keep finding these accounts, verifying them, and telling them exactly as they happened.